Welcome back to the Buffalo Reformed Podcast. In this episode, I'd like to talk about America First politics as well as some just war theory. Should be interesting. And the way that I want to approach this is from C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, particularly the last book, The Last Battle. It's number 7 in the Chronicles, and it's basically Lewis exploring the eschatology of Narnia. In this story, Shift, who's an ape, finds a lion skin, and he uses it to deceive the Narnians into believing that he is the spokesperson for Aslan. And he does this to enslave the Narnians for his own profit, and he sells them to a neighboring people, the Calormans, who are foreign. They live to the south, and they worship a different god. Eventually, Tirian, who's the true king of Narnia, uncovers the deception and seeks to free the Narnians from both the lies and the foreign invaders. And I think you can see how prescient this story actually is in our own day for the perspective that many of us have. The issue of mass immigration, political corruption, these have been prominent issues before us, even more so in the last few months. But the debacles of COVID-19 did much to uncover some of this corruption, and particularly the trust that many of us placed in these institutions we were raised to appreciate. So when the masks came off, pun intended, and the deception was seen, the question is, what's our response to that? What's the correct response? In the story, Tirian is trying to stand for truth and righteousness in the name of the true Aslan as a means of fighting the deception. He both seeks to unmask the lie and give the truth in its place. However, Lewis devotes an entire chapter to one particular group that does not have a healthy response to the deception. The chapter is titled Mainly About Dwarfs. When Tirian frees a group of dwarfs from the Calormans and triumphantly announces that they will march against the invading people in the morning, they respond with this, quote, "I don't think we want any more kings. If you are Tirian, which you don't look like him, no more than we want any Aslans. We're going to look after ourselves from now on and touch our caps to nobody, see?" "That's right," said the dwarves. "We're on our own now. No more Aslan, no more kings, no more silly stories about other worlds. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs." End quote. The response to deception is not to seek truth, but rather to retreat into cynicism and tribalism. They throw away really any form of institutional or political truth and become deeply cynical toward anyone in authority, especially anyone who might profit from their allegiance. And we know how this ends for them. Their cynicism actually leads them to attack both sides in the great battle at the end. And ultimately, it leads them to be in a position to not recognize when a true judgment of Aslan is taking place. They're so afraid of being deceived that they're unable to recognize the truth. The dwarfs are for the dwarfs. It's a tribal mantra. And it reminds me in some ways of America First. My qualification here is this. I'm not advocating for a disordered preference of neighbor over one's own. I do believe that the America First movement is seeking to correct a wrong in this area. We have been told to care for immigrants, even if it is doing harm to our own society and identity. But Scripture teaches that we ought to have more regard for our own household than for our neighbors. I'm not going to work for my neighbor's kids. I'm going to work for my own kids. I go to work to support my family. So I'm not critiquing that corrective of the America First movement. However, prioritizing my family does not mean that I can ignore my neighbor when he is in need. And if my neighbor does great evil to those in his power, under his authority, in his household, I may even intervene. If it doesn't, even if it's not directly benefiting me. It may not be directly to the benefit of my household. I would be doing it just for the sake of the innocents in his household who are suffering. It's for justice. And that is really my concern with the America First movement. I don't want it to become a dwarfs are for the dwarfs mentality, which lends itself to turning a blind eye to atrocities committed by others simply because it doesn't concern us, or it might affect our bottom line. Gas prices might go up. So if we think about this in relation to the situation in Iran, I would be more willing to hear sharp criticism of the Trump administration if more weight were given to the evils committed by the Iranian regime. If those atrocities were genuinely reckoned with by critics, then when they are critical of the U.S. and our actions abroad, that would carry more of a moral weight for me. But as it stands, I am glad that that regime has been toppled, that they've begun to pay for their crimes. America's judgment will come in its own time. That's true. And this is what we see in the Old Testament. This is the same pattern. Israel, as a sinful nation, is judged by Assyria, and then God then judges Assyria as well. It's this pattern. God can use, I'm not saying America is equivalent to Israel. I'm saying that the notion of God using a sinful nation to judge another nation justly is the pattern that we see in the Old Testament. So in my mind, even if the reasons that the Trump administration went into Iran were unjust, which they may have been, the end result of that, I'm arguing, was justice, because an evil regime was toppled. Similarly, if Donald Trump was calling for, or was actually committing, genocide in the United States, it would be justice for another country to take out the Trump administration. That would be from God's perspective, justice. We're not talking about loyalty to a country or to a region or to a state. We're talking about loyalty to the morality of God's transcendent law. And when a regime is acting in a manner that is destructive, and then it has a downfall at the hands of another nation, which is just as sinful, we can still recognize that that was a just action. And I see many critiques of the U.S. against Iran, but I don't see many people acknowledging that this was ultimately a good thing that happened, because they're afraid that this is going to result in an endorsement of the reasons we went in the first place. And it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to endorse the reasons, but you can still celebrate the result. So in this sense, all this to say that I'm okay with the America First movement, what it intends to correct. But I'm not okay with it if it is being used to justify turning a blind eye to international injustice. And I'm also not advocating for America as the world's police force. But if I'm a Navy SEAL, for example, and an evil dictator is mowing down his citizens, or there's a tribal chief in Africa chopping the heads off Christians, then I'm being asked to be sent into that because I want to put a stop to that. I want to be used in a Romans 13 sense as a minister, a servant, restraining evil and promoting good. And the critics would call that perspective American imperialism, but I call it a grace of God, that evil is being restrained. And you can call that what you will. But if Donald Trump sent Navy SEALs into Africa to take out tribal war chiefs who are chopping the heads off Christians, I would be celebrating that. I wouldn't be saying, oh, there's another example of American colonialism. That just it does not make sense to me. Anyway, so the whole point I'm advocating in this section is that God has granted that Christianity have a pretty influential place in American politics. And America, God has granted that it's one of the most, if not the most influential nations in the entire global community. And we ought not be afraid to use our influence to punish evil and promote good. This is what God has instituted the magistrate for, according to Romans 13. It's a minister that punishes evil and promotes good. And when it does that, God is praised. And when it doesn't do that, then it will be judged. And that's the entire perspective that I am advocating for. The reasons that the Trump administration went into Iran, debatable. I don't know if they were just. I don't know if they had the right intentions. I don't trust that many of them understand God's law and true morality in the way that I do. So it'd be very hard for me to advocate for the decisions that they made in any meaningful way. But the end result of that was a terrorist regime was taken down. They were decimated. And that is something that I think can be viewed as an overall positive. And so let's now move into what I think is driving these critiques, really. What's behind the scenes? Why is it that people are critiquing it in this way? And because we have people on the right side of the spectrum who are critiquing it, and I would argue for we need to prioritize our loves reasons. We need to prioritize our household before we try to fix other people's households. And I respect that. But there's another reason why people are against it, and these two are becoming strange bedfellows. And it's critical race theory. This is a framework that is very dominant in our academic institutions, and it reads history as a conflict between oppressor and oppressed. The group with structural power or technology is assumed to be morally suspect. They're going to be oppressive because they have all the authority, all the power, all the leverage. The group without power is then, contrastly, assumed to be morally justified or at least morally excused in many cases. And when you overlay this power dynamic over situations like Iran, you can hear critiques such as, we're the ones in their territory, so who are we to criticize their actions if they're engaging in terrorist activity, for example? Or they're simply standing up for themselves against the Western colonial bully. Okay, that's the perspective. It's the West has invaded in a land where they ought not be, and now we're getting all offended whenever the little guy is defending itself against the giant. But the question they're not asking is, what does God's law say about what these people are doing over there? What is this particular regime, or if we're using Iran as the example, what is the Iranian leader doing to his own people? They're not asking that question. They're asking who has more power and who has local authority. The United States has more power, and the Iranians have local authority, and therefore the United States needs to back off because if they do anything, they're going to be considered a bully, and secondly, they don't have a right to do anything because it's not their area. That's the perspective. And then you put on top of that this really deep cynicism towards anything related to what's perceived as American imperialism. And the assumption is that the real reason we ever set foot in a foreign land is only for naked self-interest. Oil, contracts, domestic politics, whatever it is. Not justice, though. And in the same way, you'll often hear that some powerful lobby is pulling the strings, especially when Israel is involved. And we're not going to go there. We're not going there today in this episode. Maybe we will in the future, but not right now. The argument is essentially the same. Whatever America does abroad must be explained entirely in terms of power, leverage, and self-benefit. And once you've accepted that framing, the idea that a powerful nation might sometimes act as a real instrument of justice becomes preposterous. Institutions, Western Christianity, the church, Christendom, America, whatever it is, they're treated not primarily as bearers of truth, but as tools of power. Christianity in the West gets framed as the religious arm of white Western male dominance. Crusades, colonialism, slavery, patriarchy, and so on. And once that viewpoint becomes your paradigm, anytime a Christian says, this war was just, or this campaign was righteous, it sounds like we're justifying an action with religious language. We're just coming along to say, okay, these are all the ways that we can justify this religiously, and slide by. And this explains why the modern mind has this instinctive desire to flatten all cultures into an equivalence. They would say things like, yes, the natives did brutal things, but the conquistadors did brutal things too. So who are we to judge? Yes, Islam did brutal things, but the Crusaders did brutal things too. So who are we to judge? Yes, the Iranian regime did brutal things, but America has done brutal things too. So who are we to judge? Everything is flattened into all sides are equally evil, therefore no cause is ultimately just. And beneath that lies a deeper assumption. There is no transcendent, objective judge in heaven weighing the nations by a single moral standard. A cross-cultural standard, I might add. There's only power and counter-power. And once you deny a transcendent judge in an objective moral law, you are left with might makes right. And that is why so many secular social justice readings of history boiled everything down to power dynamics. Whoever had the most technology, the money, the institutions, whatever it is. Modern critics think that by approaching things in this way, they have actually transcended tribalism by blaming every tribe equally, or by looking equally cynically at every nation. They believe that because a nation has sovereignty, that therefore other nations cannot judge their actions. And I'm arguing that this perspective amounts to a denial of God's transcendence and erases his law as the standard by which we can judge if something was righteous. The flattening of all cultures is a counterfeit transcendence. Instead of rising above the tribes to judge them by God's word, it flattens everything into one gray mass of power struggles and then shrugs. We don't know. We should be able to say that an overall action was just, or at least the result of something was just, even if many of the actors and individual acts may have been sinful. And by way of example, we can think of the common example that's used today, and that's the Conquista in South America. Critics highlight Columbus's moral failures as proof that the Conquista against the Native Americans was morally unjustifiable. The argument would run this way. Yes, the natives committed brutal acts, but the conquistadors did too. So why trade one brutality for another? The only reason you could do that is because you think that your team is the right one, and therefore you're going to just baptize it. And the answer to that question, in my opinion, is why? Why trade one brutality for another? Well, because I believe that Christian society that upholds the value of each human being is better than a pagan society that enslaves and sacrifices human beings. The civilizational brutality of the Aztecs deserved to be brought down according to God's law. And we can say this without justifying the many evils committed by the conquistadors, the people whom God used to bring down the pagan, demon-influenced society. So to put it another way, the sins of the judge do not acquit the criminal, and the sins of the criminal do not excuse the judge. The judge could be having an affair, and yet he could still render a just judgment against a murderer. And on the other side, just because somebody has murdered someone does not mean that the judge has carte blanche in terms of how they judge that person. All of those things are constrained by God's moral law. And we have to recover the ability to distinguish the justice of the cause from the sins of the participants. It's very difficult for us to do this. And my point here is not that America is innocent or that our motives are always perfect, nor that even the motivation driving our bombing in Iran was good. I'm not making that argument. My point is that when you deny the possibility of objective justice, you are forced to reduce every action to power plays. And any admission that something was just, in turn, sounds like propaganda. And that is the dwarf's prison. They refuse to be taken in by Aslan. And I'm concerned that this characterizes how we look at international conflicts today. We're refusing to be deceived, and therefore we cannot find a just cause anywhere. We're afraid that the reasons were evil, and therefore we're unwilling to say that the end result was just because it might make it look like we are advocating for the reasons that they used to get to that end. It doesn't have to be the case. You can say, this was just result. I'm not sure what their reasoning was that got them there. It could have been good, could have been bad. Anyway, you cut the mustard, the result was good. It's become, but this perspective has really become the default position for evaluating international conflict. Since there is assumed to be no moral transcendent standard by which we can judge the nations, we conclude that we ought not interfere with other nations unless they directly threaten us. That is, the dwarfs are for the dwarfs. We refuse to judge, to act, to admit that some regimes truly deserve to fall. And for all the good that Donald Trump does stand for, in my opinion, this is the area that he is lacking in. He struggles with this. He often grants the relativistic premise. Everyone's crooked, every nation is just looking out for itself. And then he argues purely from interest, leverage, and strength from that framework. We want to win, and we will continue winning in this grand power struggle for supremacy, and America is supreme. We want American triumphalism. Are you sick of winning yet? But this perspective just gives more fuel to the critics who see Trump as a prideful wannabe American hero. And they look at him as somebody who only cares about American imperialism and political theater that just simply benefits him and his administration. But biblically, God used Assyria to judge Israel, and then he judges Assyria. He used Babylon to judge Judah, and then judges Babylon. The fact that the rod may be crooked does not mean the blow was not an act of judgment. And the fact that the blow might have been an act of judgment does not mean the rod is innocent. I am willing to say the Crusades, as a civilizational response to Muslim aggression, that they were just. I'm willing to say that the Conquista, as a civilizational response to a demonically barbaric system, was just. And that America, when it acts to restrain a genuinely murderous regime, can be just. And at the same time, I will not pretend that the Crusaders, the conquistadors, or Americans are right with God simply because their cause in a particular instance might be just. Nor will I deny that often the causes that could be just are used in ways that diminish their justice. All those things are true. But where does this leave us? As Christians, we must refuse both naive tribalism and paralyzing cynicism. We're not for the dwarfs, and we are not for the American empire. We are for the kingdom of Jesus Christ. We judge the actions of nations, parties, and leaders by the transcendent law of God, and we rest in his providence over history. And that ought to free us to name real evil and to affirm real acts of justice, even if they're carried out by crooked rods, and to trust that the judge of all the earth will do right in the end.